Let me see if it's going. I think it's going. I think it's going.
Got it. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's processing. It didn't. I think it's going now.
My computer says yes. It's
Yeah,
being
so
lucky.
It's working
yeah,
now.
so I think it's
Okay.
live.
Yay.
Okay. Thank you for the inconvenience. The only thing I can say is that I tried and it worked before. So I'm sure it's me. It's not the computer, but very quickly welcome you all. And I was going to say when I was reminded that we were not live, just very quickly to mention that next week we're going to hear from Jennifer Smith from Mills College in the USA, and she'll be presenting on comparative social evolution in mammals. But today, the person that is joining us and is going to be presenting for us, we have Sheng-Feng Shen, who is a researcher in the Biodiversity Research Center in Taiwan, in the Sinica Institute. And Sheng-Feng completed his PhD at Cornell University in animal behavior. His advisor was Stephen Emlen. Some of you who may not know Sheng-Feng's advisor definitely know his son, Doug Emlen, who presented last semester. After completing his PhD in Cornell, he went back to Taiwan. No, actually, he went back to Taiwan, but he also did spend some time in the University of Cambridge, completing some postdocs. And then eventually he became a researcher at the institute where he's today. And today he will be presenting his research on ecological causes and consequences of sociality. He has developed different research systems, including beetles and also birds, where he approaches a number of questions that are tackled both from theoretical perspective. He has a very strong mathematical, analytical training and skills that he brings to bear on questions that he explores in relationship to global change, in relationship to biogeography and behavioral ecology. So I have no doubts that we're up for a fantastic presentation. Sheng-Feng decided to explore further what we saw Doug Emlen did. So he pre-recorded his presentation, and I can tell you that the presentation is exactly 52 minutes long. I tell you that so that you know when it will be done, because some of you need to go at noon. But it's only 11:06, so I think we will have time for you, even if you need to go at noon, to watch the full video. And after that, as usual, for those of you who are new, we're going to have 1 hour of questions and answers. I ask you that you type in the question mark for your questions in the chatting window. I'll repeat that once the presentation is completed. So without further saying, I want to welcome Dr. Sheng-Feng Shen. Sheng-Feng, a pleasure having you with us. And please, if you want to take it from here, I think you are a co-host already. You can share your screen and we can go straight to your video.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and it's really great to present in this seminar. So as Eduardo said, that I watched several videos and the fine seminars, and I decided to do as Dr. Emlen did last time. So I'll play my video now, and then of course I'll stay with you guys, and later I'll answer the questions. Okay, let me play the video.
So today I'm going to talk about two main topics. One is how does ecology affect the social evolution and its ecological consequences. And then I'm going to talk more generally about how ecology affects spatial and temporal pattern of biodiversity. I'll show you in a minute why I would go from social evolution to pattern of biodiversity. So basically, I'm a behavior ecologist by training. And the reason I get into this business is simply because I love birds. Like bird watching when I was an undergrad student. So I started to study birds. And this is the bird I study. It's called Taiwan yuhina, which is a very special bird because they have a joint nesting behavior, which are several unrelated pairs they will form a nest and taking care of young together. So one important thing is they form non-kin groups. So at that time, because they are non-kin, so I don't really care much about the inclusive fitness. Naturally, I care more about how ecology affect their social behavior. After that, I actually did extensive field work in other systems, for example, the bracket social weavers too. Okay, so if you're interested in the yuhina study, you can read this summary chapters. While I'm doing the yuhina field work, when I was at Cornell doing my PhD, I start to become interested in theoretical modeling. So at that time, Dr. Steve Emlen, Dr. Kern Reeve, and then my postdoc advisor, Rufus Johnstone, they all helped me a lot. So I spent lots of time doing modeling. But it's really at this point that when I try to publish my result on yuhinas, so what we found is very cool. We found that they are actually more cooperative in the harsh environment, and we did I think it's very cool again theoretical model to show that actually the reason that they're more cooperative in the harsh environment is the cost of cost of engaging in social conflict is just too high in the harsh environment. So actually everyone ends up better in the harsh environment because the environment limits their social conflict. Okay, but I'm not going to talk more about yuhina today. And one of the reasons is when I actually shift my system more to the social insect, especially for barren beetle now. And the reason is that when I submit this paper 10 years ago in Science, one of the reviewer actually said that, well, all your study are correlation. Can you manipulate the environmental condition to prove that it's really the environment affecting their cooperative and conflict behavior? Well, as you know, in this case, the environmental conditions, the rainfall, I feel like there's no way I can manipulate them. We try to manipulate the food, but it's different. Okay, so then and also because I'm doing this modeling work at that time, is the reproductive skill theory. So I decide to find an insect as a model system. In this case, I decided to use the barren beetles in Taiwan. Okay. It turns out it's very rewarding and ideal system because the barren beetle, the Nicolensis, they are widely distributed species. So it actually sort of opened my view about the ecological environment in the Asia area. We study their behaviors, ecologies in a large spatial scales, which is I'm not able to do in the bird study. For example, these are our field sites. It includes Taiwan, we have 3 sites, and the Amami Island in Japan, and Sichuan in China. So one thing we found is actually we haven't get to the social behavior point yet because it's kind of still difficult to watch the videos of their behavior in such large sample size. Okay, but what we found is apparently, I mean, we can find is their breeding season are very different. So we start to be interested about these breeding adaptations. So one thing is even just within Taiwan, the northern Taiwan, the wulai population, they only breed in the winter. But in the mountain Lala and Hehuan, okay, they breed year round. Whereas in Amami Island, which is a small island in Japan with very low mountain, okay, they only also breed in the winter. And whereas in China, Sichuan, they only breed in the summer. Okay? So we actually become interested in their local adaptation to the environmental condition. And studying barren beetle also allows me, I really like to go outdoors and explore things. and barren beetle study because of its large spatial scale. So we can explore many different types of habitats. For example, this is in China. We can drive in these really remote area and do our studies to see the effect of habitat, for example, habitat development, their breeding. But we also apply the genomic approach to study barren beetles' breeding behavior. And in this case, we want to know the genomic basis of their different, for example, the year-round breeding and versus seasonal breeding. And we make some good progress. Also, we recently, this year, we just successfully developed the AI technology to automatically quantify the social behavior of beetles. So I think hopefully you will see our result very soon that we now have the capacity to analyze the social behavior in these different populations. Previously, you do 10-hour experiment. Probably it takes you 100 hours to analyze these videos. But we finally overcome this problem. I'm really excited about this. Okay, we also apply the AI technique to analyze the morphological and also physiological diversity of animals. So one of the topics we study is actually we compare the morphological trait of social versus non-social birds. And AI is really a good tool for you to quantify the animal features. Okay, but yeah, since the constraint, let's go back to the main topic today about social evolution. So first, I think everyone here is familiar with the Hamilton's rule. But just based on this simple Hamilton's rule, you can see if relatedness equal to 1, you still need to have B minus C greater than 0. On the other hand, if R equal to 0, minus C, meaning that the cost of doing this behavior is going to be negative, meaning that you're going to have directedness of doing things. So in other words, based on the Hamilton's rule, it already guarantees you that ecology is going to be an important component to understand social behavior. And the main focus today is, as I said, it's going to be how ecology actually influences sociality. And there is a long-lasting paradox. We call it the paradox of environmental quality and sociality. I think as far as I can tell, it's first proposed by Steve Emlen, my PhD advisor. His famous paper on ecological constraint, he asked the question, why do similar social organizations occur in such seemingly opposite ecological situation? And his solution is, he proposed the ecological constraint. Basically, the idea is, he thinks that general property of the cooperative breeder are offspring delay dispersal. And there are two main mechanisms causing offspring delay dispersal. One is the breeding opening are non-exist, meaning that generally known as habitat saturation. So this often occur in stable environment when population density is high. So I think in other words, it occurs in a benign and stable environments. On the other hand, we saw many cooperative breeders occur in fluctuating harsh environments. And his explanation for this is because cost of rearing young is prohibited because the cost is very high, so you need to stay at your natal territory. So these pattern together, it results that offspring is going to postpone dispersal and stay in the natal territory, okay, and form a stable kin groups. So an important component of the ecological constraint theory is offspring needs to delay dispersal. In other words, the key question is why offspring stay, and then why offspring help, which we won't get into the details. But I think the apparent problem is why we only consider upstream state. Okay, and I think that's one of the key reasons causes the problem of ecological constraint that people often criticize that a lack of predictive power, because so many species also face similar high ecological constraint, meaning high habitat saturation or fluctuating environment. But why do they form cooperative groups? Okay, and also because this theory based on the upstream delay dispersal, so it's difficult to apply this theory to explain the formation of dunking groups. So to resolve this paradox, we propose the key is to consider the fitness interests for all the group members. In other words, it's called insider-outsider conflict framework. Okay, so previously, if you only consider the upstream fitness and upstream strategy, that means you only consider the strategy of potential joiner. But for social group to form, so-called insider, the existing group member's interest also needs to consider. So if you consider the interest of all group member, then I think a general rule would emerge, which is the grouping benefit. In other words, it's like if you want to start a company, no matter how closely related your partner are with you, your company still needs to be able to make money, okay? And the amount of money you make needs to be larger than if you start a company separately, okay? So you have a net benefit to share. This is the basic concept of grouping benefit. That's why it's called grouping benefit, okay? And people oftentimes study social behavior, focus on relatedness because they think relatedness is the general pattern. But what I want to argue here is if you look at the grouping benefit, which is, you can in a way look at it by comparing the relationship between group size and per capita productivity. There are actually not that many types of relationship. Okay, so I would argue actually there are only two basic types. One is the group, the per capita productivity first increase with group size and then decrease. Okay, and then another type is the per capita productivity decrease as the increase of group size. And the first type I'll call it's called collective action benefits. So that means there are some benefits generated through collective action behavior. Okay, needs some coordination. Okay, some example would be the benefit of coping with environmental challenges through cooperation. For example, predator avoidance or predator mounting, okay, or fighting against interspecific competition. Okay, so oftentimes in this type of benefit occur in the harsh environment because the environmental challenge is higher. On the other hand, there's different types of grouping benefit called resource defense benefit, which is often described in the cooperative reading birds. The pattern you will find is the per capita productivity actually decrease with the increase of group size. Okay, and so you might ask why this is a benefit. The benefit is actually the potential joiner. Oftentimes your offspring, they don't have place to go. Okay? That's why you will see that even the joining of the offspring or offspring state will lower the per capita productivity. The parents will still allow their offspring to stay, and the offspring would be willing to stay because the outside option of dispersing is just too low. Okay? That's why you will see these resource defense benefits. And for this to occur, I think it's easy to understand that it has to be in the case that with high population density. So there is a limited outside option, limited empty vacant territories that you can disperse. Okay, so based on this, we call dual benefit framework. we will predict that okay, in stable benign environment, it's more likely to favor the resource defense benefit, which would result in the kin groups. And one interesting prediction is we would also argue that because cooperation is fighting against intraspecific competition, so will be little benefit for the population or species of this kind of benefits. Okay, and then if it's in the harsh environment, it would favor the collective action benefit. And in this case, the social group can be formed with relative or non-kin members, okay? Because the key is you need to be able to reach the most productive sites. It's good for everyone. Okay? So if kin is available, we would form kin groups. But if in the case is that, for example, the mortality is high, then the non-kin group would also be allowed to join the groups. Okay, and in this case, is because the benefit of cooperation is fighting against the environmental challenge or interspecific competition. So this would allow the cooperation would allow the species to occupy wider niche or larger range size or have higher abundance, which we will test in a moment. So first test we are going to do is the first is the famous cooperative breeding starlings done by Dustin Rubenstein. So he shows that basically starlings or the birds in general are more likely to form cooperative breeding groups when the temporal variability, environmental temporal variability are high. Okay, but on the other hand, in hornbills study, this study shows that actually hornbill would form cooperative breeding groups in stable environment. Okay, this sort of fits the previous observation that it's paradoxical that in such different environments, both would favor the evolution of cooperative breeding. Okay, so we redo the analysis. We show that actually indeed starling would form social group in the harsh environment, and hornbills will form groups in a stable environment. Okay, so the key is key prediction of the dual benefit framework is we will predict that the species cooperating in the harsh environment, actually cooperation would enable them to have a larger range size than the non-cooperative species, which is what we found here. In contrast, for the hornbills, because the cooperation is against the intraspecific competition, okay, so there is no impact of their social behavior on the range size. So we found similar range size between hornbill, cooperative and non-cooperative hornbills. So then we expand our analysis to all the bird species. Interesting, to do this, actually, first you need to determine which clade is which clade cooperate in stable benign environment versus they cooperate in harsh, frustrating environment. Okay, so we first performed clade label analysis, and we found that there are 8 clade, including about 800 species. They found their social groups in harsh or fluctuating environment. Okay, as you can show here, see here. Okay, so what we found is the harsh environment favor cooperative breeding, which in turn enable them to have a larger range size, as we found in the starling case. Furthermore, we also found that cooperation also enable them to have a higher abundance. Okay, also as we predict by the dual benefit framework. Okay. On the other hand, there are much fewer clades who cooperate in the stable environment. We only found 4 clades and about 250 species cooperate in benign or stable environment. Okay, and in this case, cooperation does not influence their range size. Okay, and then although range size still influence their abundance, but it's not affected by their social system, meaning that they cooperate or not. It doesn't influence their range size or abundance. Okay, and the data we didn't show here is there are actually many other clades. We are not able to find any ecological pattern or ecological factors influence their cooperative behavior. I suspect maybe one reason is we don't have enough sample sizes in these clades, so the solution resolution might not be high enough, but that's another issue. And also this another prediction of the dual benefit framework is we would predict that the species cooperating in the stable benign environment are more likely to form kin groups. Okay, and species found in harsh frustrating environment are more likely to form non-kin group, or if you will, you can call it mixed kinship group. Okay, this is also what we found here. So we find pretty good match of the empirical results versus our model predictions. Okay, and then we further develop a more formal simulation models to explore the relationship between different types of grouping benefit and and its relationship with environmental quality and its ecological consequences. I think what's amazingly we can show here is that for the resource defense benefit, it does occur in a more stable environment, okay, or a more benign environment. Whereas in the collective action benefit, it's more likely to evolve in the harsh, fluctuating environment. But if you combine these two environmental quality or two environmental conditions, what you can see here is if you don't distinguish between resource defense benefit versus collective action benefit, cooperative breeding can actually occur in all kinds of ecological environments. Okay? I think that's why what we found that in every ecological condition, we pretty much can find cooperative breeder. And I think this sort of provides the theoretical framework to resolve the paradox of environmental quality and sociality. We can also explore the spatial pattern about how cooperation influence the range size and abundance of the species. So what you can see here is for collective action benefit. In this figure, we assume in the center, the ecological environment is better, is benign environment, and in the edge of the figure, it's more harsh environment. So what you can show is in the collective action benefit, the cooperator, actually they are clustered in the peripheral area, okay? And that's the reason that cooperation actually can help the species or population to have larger range size and higher abundance. Versus if you look at the resource defense type, the cooperation actually is occur in more benign environment. Okay, so it's clustered in the more or less in the center. So it has smaller impact, okay, on the range size or abundance of the species. Okay? I think this model can show you formally on our verbal argument. And we can further explore the spatial pattern of resource and cooperation. Okay, but I'm not going to get into the details. So let's come back to the question of the paradox. Okay? So basically, why do similar social organizations occur in such seemingly opposite ecological situations? And our answer is, I think, cooperative breeding is an umbrella term. It includes the social groups formed by different reasons, meaning the collective action benefit and resource defense benefit. Okay? That's why oftentimes we would say the ecological constraint theory is lack of predictive power. with the distinction of these two types of benefit, now we can predict the ecological consequences and demographic consequences of sociality. And I think this also can help explain the success and dominance of social species, okay, which is proposed by Edward Wilson. Is the social conquest of Earth's book. So I call it social conquest hypothesis. But I think Wilson only addressed part of the question. So basically, he explains the success and dominance of the social order. But on the other hand, I think everyone knows that social species are relatively rare in animal society, in animal kingdom. For example, there are only about 10% of the species bird species are cooperative breeding. And I think the reason it's rare is because only selected environment that can favor the evolution of cooperative breeding. We can show that in we show that in model, but I didn't sort of show the results. Okay, and then I'm going to move to the more empirical system about the barren beetles. So basically, we can also test this dual benefit framework in barren beetles. The key prediction we're going to test is about this mainly the cooperation occur in the peripheral area, which in harsh peripheral area, which enable them to expand their range size and abundance. Okay. On the other hand, we would also expect that if it's a resource defense benefit, the cooperation is more likely to occur in the benign environment. Okay, and we're going to test the possibility that whether these two kinds of benefit can occur within the species. Okay, so the study species is the barren beetle, Nicophorus nicolensis. We performed this study along the elevational gradient in Taiwan. Okay, so the nicolensis we study is a facultative cooperative breeder. They form breeding groups by non-kin members, and they're widely distributed in East and Southeast Asia. This is their barren processes. So remember, one barren beetle is very small. It's only about 0.3 gram. Okay, and the carcass we provide them is 75 gram. Okay, so you can see they can. It's a huge amount of work for them to prepare and bury the carcass. And this is and we also show that this is the most important stage for their cooperation that impact the breeding success of them. So we perform a very large scale field studies, and it takes a lot of work, and we have an army of students and assistants doing this. So what we do is we have two treatments. One is we provide 6 individuals, so we call it group treatment, and another is we provide 2 individuals. Okay, in this specially designed breeding box, which the environmental factor is relatively the same as in the nature condition. One of the key is this design allows the blowfly, the key competitors of barren beetle, can fly in and out freely. Okay, but the barren beetle from the environment cannot get in. Okay, so we can test. Basically, we force them to have groups versus solitary. So what we found here is the per capita productivity for the social groups, for the group treatment is actually lower in the benign environment, which is the lower temperature region. Okay, in other words, the per capita productivity of the group treatment is lower than the solitary treatment. Okay, this fits the resource defense benefit. Okay, and what you can see on the right is in the harsh environment, when the blowfly competition is higher, the group treatment actually have a higher per capita productivity than the solitary treatment. Okay, so this sort of bit that fits the prediction that they cooperate in the harsh environment. And we first quantify their behaviors. Okay, so what we show again is actually beetles are more cooperative. They invest more time cooperatively in the group treatment. Okay, there is no significant difference for the paired treatment in relation to the environmental temperature. And we also found that social conflict is higher in the benign environment, which is about 16 degrees. The environmental temperature is 16 degrees, which is best for them to breed, and also the place that they have highest population density. Okay. We also performed lab experiment to confirm the role of interspecific competition on the beetles' cooperative behavior. Okay. So indeed, what we found is in the below fly treatment, okay, the barren beetle are more cooperative with higher total amount of investment time and also lower per capita social conflict. So this can show you that actually it's easy to induce their cooperative behavior by interspecific competition. What's even more amazing is we found that the cue they use for to decide whether they are cooperative or not is actually the smell of the carcass, the degree of carcass decomposition. Okay? So there's a chemical which is the DMDS. If you inject them in the mouse carcass, you will find that beetles become more cooperative. Okay? We didn't see that they have higher or lower conflict, and I suspect because they, in the real case, they need to process the carcass to have blowfly method to remove and clean. So, but in this case, they just sort of trying to figure out where are these scent decomposing meats are come from. So you can see in the video clips. So we found that they are more cooperative in the we call it social chemicals treatment. So in conclusion, in this part is we do find that barren beetle are more cooperative in the harsh environment and in the boundary of their distribution range. So if you calculate the breeding success along the environmental gradient, we will find that the group treatment, the social barren beetle actually can have wider distribution range and wider thermal niche compared to the solitary ones. Okay. So this, again, I think it confirmed the prediction of our dual benefit framework. To take this idea more generally, I think this suggests that actually social animals, when you are facing harsh environments, actually, if your cooperation is based on the harsh fighting against the harsh environment, actually they would enable you to fight against the harsh environment, which results in actually a better range size in this case, better niche width, and higher population density. Okay, so I think that tells you harsh environment actually sometimes is good for the species. So similar argument I think occur in humans. In famous Chinese saying, we call it the tribe in the calamity and perish in soft vivid. So that means I think in many Chinese or East Asia people, we have the idea that actually harsh environment is in a way good for you. And that's oftentimes we train our kids. And I'll tell you later, it's not necessarily always good, but in some cases it's good. Okay, I think in the West, the Nietzsche has the similar argument, said that which does not kill us, make us stronger. So that's sort of similar idea. So we can apply this concept to other phenomena, I think. For example, the famous COVID-19 now, and in Taiwan, we actually have SARS in 2003. And I think that very harsh environment, very tough experience, enable us to actually react to this the current COVID-19 very quickly. This is the analysis we performed that actually in last year, we want to find a way to quantify the behavior of people compare their reactions to the SARS, to the COVID-19. Okay, so in this case, you can see the Google search in Taiwan. It's very early in the year that Taiwan, when people heard about the possibility of a SARS-like virus, people become very nervous, and you can see the people are searching for masks. So everyone.
Sheng-Feng, you're muted.
Sorry, I muted you because of your phone. I didn't know it moved.
No, it isn't my phone, but I don't hear the video now. Sheng-Feng, can you pause the video? Am I the only one who lost sound on the video?
I also can't hear him.
Virus. Everyone wear masks, and the infection, the influenza cases actually become almost zero. Okay, whereas we can compare the rest of the world that is not experienced SARS. Okay, for example, US is a good example that actually you can see here. No one actually cared about masks until CDC announced that people, should wear a mask. But still, I think people are reluctant to do that. And as a result, you can see here the influenza cases in US last year, it's almost identical. That's the predicted trend based on the previous year. Okay. So I think that sort of shows you that harsh environment, actually, sometimes it really makes us stronger. But on the other hand, if you look at these straightforward cases, okay, so if you listen to my talk and said, okay, harsh environment is good, then, well, you decide not to give your kids any money, just kick them out to the street. What would happen? I think what would happen is just like this case. That's my plants sitting on my desk, and I often forget to watering them. Okay, so after a few weeks, you can see they just dying. But if you give them water, they will grow very well. So I think there is there are contrasting effects of environmental harshness. Okay. Harsh environment is not always good. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. I think that's the most intriguing issues. So one application of this is we can look at the global pattern of species vulnerability to climate change. So the basic argument, if people ask you about whether tropical species or temperate species are more vulnerable to the climate change, I think most people would tell you it's the tropical species. And one reason is because tropical species live in stable environment. So the idea is called climatic variability hypothesis. So because tropical species live in stable environment, so they evolve to have a very narrow thermal niche width. Okay, that's why, as shown in this figure, that's why when you have a climate warming, okay, they will be into a big trouble. Whereas the temperate species, because they already experience seasonal variation of the years. Okay, so I think people generally think that they have a wider niche, thermal niche, so it's less affected by temporal by the climate change. Okay, but what we found is if you do the empirical test. This is the study we did by global vertebrate. It's not necessarily the case, okay? On one hand, we just found that higher seasonal temperature variation would enhance larger range size. On the other hand, we also found that higher diurnal temperature range, okay? It's also higher environmental variation, but just in a shorter time period actually result in narrower range size, meaning that narrower niche width. So we also perform theoretical study to demonstrate that actually the temporal variation, the scale of the temporal variation is very important. And the basic argument is for the short-term variation, actually you can avoid the unfavorable environment. For example, for daily temperature variation, actually it's better for you to become diurnal or nocturnal. Just avoid some part of the unfavorable environment. So actually the shorter environmental variation will generally select for specialization. So I think that has an important implication about environmental harshness. That means harshness always not select for stronger, if you will, species. Okay, if it's a relatively short time scale variation, actually it would also select for specialization. Okay, that also means that not only tropical species are vulnerable. We should also look at those species living in higher diurnal temperature variation. They're also vulnerable species. Okay, so on the other hand, if you're interested in this issue, we actually have more theoretical papers on this. Okay, on the other hand, I have also been thinking about how benign environment would shape biodiversity. Because for social species, it seems like the harsh environment is actually good for these social species in a sense. But how about the benign environment? So one study we did is we analyzed the morphological pattern, morphological diversity of the moss in Taiwan, okay, using the AI approach. So the reason we use AI is it can quantify many image feature that is difficult to quantify objectively without AI. This is also one of the biggest development of artificial intelligence in the past decade. Okay, so what we show is actually, if you look at the figures, the blue region represent, we call it morphospace. The low elevation species actually occupy a large morphospace, meaning that they are more different, much more different than the higher elevation species. You can see the species living below 1,000 meters in elevation actually occupy more than 2/3 of morphospace. But species living in higher elevation actually they look more similar. And we can perform detailed analysis, and we show that it actually is the reason that the colder temperature, it's like we call it environmental filter. So it's a harsh environment. It selects for certain species who can tolerate these harsh environments. Okay. So in this case, you can think that the cold environment select for the darker color of the species. So it's just like if you only allow to paint in dark colors, it's difficult to have a colorful painting. Okay. So this is the reason we found that lower elevation actually animal can be more colorful, can be more diverse. So I think this tells you, although harsh environment might select for strong, more temperature tolerating species, but benign environment allows diversity. Okay. So that means in the benign environment, it can be dark or it can be light, it can be colorful. I think that's sort of the gift of the environment, benign environment. We also test this idea by in terms of the physiological trait. In this case, it's the thermal tolerance of the moss. And the reason we did this is it's apparent that thermal tolerance, the ability of their thermal tolerance ability is one of the key sort of to evaluate their vulnerability to climate change. So we performed this study in China, in Taiwan, and Cameron Heights. Okay, did a very sophisticated field experiment. We brought all these gears in the field. Okay. So you can imagine that my team, they do this in the middle of the night with everything along the elevational gradient. And the whole dark evening.
Sheng-Feng?
And we take the thermal tolerance data of the moss.
There is a lot of background noise on the video.
This is just the beginning of the experiment.
It's
It looks like everyone.
the music of the video will stop soon.
After doing this for 20 days, it's really a very tight. Okay, but long story short, one of the key results we found is you can see here in the more harsh environment, for example, Sichuan, China, the ability for them to tolerate hot environment is sort of highly correlated for their ability to tolerate cold environment. In other words, if you can live in a hot environment, okay, that actually make you have a trade-off effect, make you not able to live in the cold environment. So this is really different from the prediction of the climatic variability, which tell you, if you live in a variable environment, you should be stronger. You can tolerate both heat and cold environment. But what we found, it's really not the case. In Taiwan and China, there is trade-off relationship of adapting to the cold versus hot environment. What's interesting is that this relationship disappeared in Malaysia in the more benign environment. Actually, what we found here is your ability to tolerate hot or heat is uncorrelated with your ability to tolerate cold environment. Okay, so this actually results, if you look at the bottom figure, this results in a more diverse thermal trait in the Malaysia, in the tropics, than in the more harsh temperate environment. Okay, we also perform more general, more general analysis to show that this is indeed the case. Okay, so again, I think what we found is that the benign environment, the tropics, actually they select for higher physiological trait diversity for the organisms. So I think so. The short conclusion is basically the benign environment promotes diversity, and this idea actually has been argued long ago. For example, by this quote of Wallace, that he thinks that this is the benign environment is actually the reason that the tropic species are so colorful. And I think our study, both in terms of the morphological trait and physiological trait, sort of provide a formal support for his argument. Remember previously, actually, it's very difficult to do an objective analysis of the color or morphological pattern or these physiological traits in large scales. Okay. So in conclusion, I think it's actually not always the harsh environment are good for the kids. We just need to be careful that if you just provide the very harsh environment, it's actually not good. But on the other hand, if you just give your kids a lot of money without hard working, it's also not good. So the balance is you need to know that sort of the what harsh environment due to the animals. So I find there is a very interesting study. It's called in psychology. It's called learn helplessness or learn optimism. So it's very inspiring. So it shows that it's kind of cool study that they shock the dogs, and when they are young, if you shock the dogs multiple times, and there is no way they can escape, then gradually these young dogs, they would jump up, they would just give up. When you shock it, they won't react. They won't react. They won't do anything. Okay, that's called learned helplessness. Apparently, that's not good. But later on, after 2 decades, they perform another study. So if you shock the dog and then let them have the chance to escape. Okay, so when the dog learn to, when they get shocked, they would escape. Okay, they actually would become more healthy, okay, because they know they can solve this problem. So in a way, I think this study provides you a general picture that if the tough or harsh environment is something that you can overcome, actually that's probably good. It's probably like our case that if you can overcome a harsh environment through cooperation, that's better than the species just living in a good environment. I think that's sort of a one general pattern I found. I think certainly we need more study on this idea. Okay, with this, I want to thank all my lab members. As you can see, there are many of them. And I especially want to thank my collaborator, Dustin Rubenstein. I very much collaborate with him on every of my papers, and he helps me a lot. And also, I want to thank many of my collaborators. And with this, I'm ready to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheng-Feng. We are already at noon, so we understand that some of you may need to go. It was a fantastic presentation. I have no doubts that there will be no shortage of interesting questions that will keep us busy for the next hour. For those of you who are new to the series, what we do now is, Sheng-Feng, if you can, I need to remove your co-host. Oh, you've already stopped sharing the screen. There you go. So what we're going to do now is for the next hour, if you have a question that you would like to ask Dr. Shen, please in the chatting window, just type a question mark. I'll be calling you in the order that the question marks appear, but we usually give priority to our younger scholars and students. So it may be the case that we just jump over some of our senior colleagues who've asked many questions over their lifetimes in preference for our younger colleagues. We want to hear from you. We want to hear from the students. So please don't be shy. We have some wonderful students who know that they're waiting to ask questions, but if you haven't done it before, please try it. With that, Sheng-Feng, thanks for a wonderful talk, and I'm ready to start taking questions from the audience. And the first question comes from Yu. There you go. So Yu, please go ahead.
Oh, yeah, hello. So I have a question about the 2 benefits. So you mentioned in the stable environment, it will favor the resource defense benefits, which is understandable because there are enough resources. But in the harsh environment, why do you think the collective action benefits will be more important than resource defense benefits? Because as far imagination as the interspecific competition will be also an important factor for those who live in harsh environments.
Yeah, the cooperation here, I mean intraspecific cooperation. So for example, in the harsh environment, I include interspecific competition also as a kind of a harsh environment. Okay, so what I mean is with intraspecific cooperation can evolve in such case to fight against the harsh environment or the intense interspecific competition.
So you think so it's kind of like the harsh environment has overcome the interspecific competition is like it's more important to us. So the threat of the harsh environment, like for like food or protection, is like more important than fighting with each other.
Yes, so you can imagine in the case like barren beetles when there are many blowflies. If you just fight against each other, the blowfly would eat all the carcass. Okay, so everyone gets nothing. So I think that's the reason, has a very strong selective forces for them to cooperate and refrain from competing with each other.
Okay, thank you.
The next question is from Adriana Maldonado Chaparro. Adriana.
Hi, thank you. Adriana Maldonado from Universidad de Rosario in Colombia. Thank you very much for that's a very interesting talk. I have several questions, but I'm going to focus on a single one so I can give opportunity to the rest of the audience. Can you define in your talk, you mentioned harsh environments, fluctuating environments, and stable environments. And harsh environments and fluctuating environments, they were mentioned in sort of similar contexts. And I'm wondering what's the difference, or how do you define and differentiate a fluctuating environment versus a harsh environment? And what makes a harsh environment in a tropical country?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sorry, I didn't make this clear. So in our case, I mean, it's probably most clear if you look at the model, we separate the mean condition versus the degree of varied fluctuation of the resources. But there's one thing in common is if you think about the environmental fluctuation, it has to sort of change from benign to harsh. So fluctuating environment, by definition, you would experience some harsh environment, okay? So I think that's the part, we actually have a model. The idea is, well, when you experience harsh environment, population size would be smaller. And I think in that case, the selection force would be higher. So in a way, fluctuating environment would have similar effect with harsh, although there are some difference, okay? So I think in the empirical work, we combine the harsh with fluctuating versus benign and stable, although there are some subtle differences. Okay, and is that answer?
Yeah, but then what are the differences between the harsh and the fluctuating? So how can you tell them apart?
So harsh, you can imagine, you know, if put it more formally, is you have a lower mean resource availability. I think that can be one type of harsh but stable environment. Okay, I think that's a harsh. It's just bad. But fluctuating means you would have some, you know, good and bads. So I think that's the thing distinguish. But in the literature, sometimes I mean, many people, including myself, we often mix the harsh with the fluctuating. Yes.
Thank you. I'm being reminded, yes, please, as you prepare to ask your question, if you could be so kind to mention your current position and institution before asking the question, so that we continue to build the fine community of people who know each other. Our next question is from someone who hopefully doesn't need to be introduced. Karsten?
Yes, hello, I'm Carsten Schradin, a researcher at the CNRS in Strasbourg, France, working on mammalian social evolution. Thanks for this fascinating talk, and I realized that I really have to read your ecology letter paper again from 2017. I have a question similar to Xingyu. I mean, if I understand right, you distinguish the species of that resource defense is more important, like in the hornbills, or collective action, like in the starlings. But of course, you have all these benefits in all these species. I mean, obviously, if you look at cooperative breeding, all of them have collective actions, which is for foraging, care of the offspring, anti-predation. You have this in all the species. So my question is, how were you able to rank all these species on this continuum into either it's more resource defense or more collective action? Because I know many people that study their species for years and decades to determine all the benefits. Is it infant care, cooperative breeding that is the benefit, or is it predation defense? So how could you rank these species, and how sure are you that this ranking is correct?
Yeah. To me, in a way, I think this question can be very complicated because many people would say, okay, I studied, my species for 10 years. I don't know what really makes them social. But on the other hand, I think there could be some simple answers. For example, if you look at the group size per capita relationship, I think that's very informative. So if it goes down, like many cooperative breeding birds, the per capita really goes down, then I think that suggests you that's more likely the resource defense. On the other hand, I actually suggest that also, in the literature of cooperative breeding birds, there are many experiments actually you can do. For example, for testing the habitat saturation, which is the type of resource defense benefit. If you just remove some individual, create some vacancy, that means that it increases the outside option, right? So the group would resolve. These kind of manipulative experiment would be the best to demonstrate, which type of benefit there are. I think I provide summarize 8 types of experiment you can do, but I think manipulation would be good. But as I said in the talk, I don't like people suggest, for example, for mammals, you also need to, for monkeys or other higher mammals, you also doing these as a golden standard. Not necessary. I think the descriptive part, for example, per capita productivity, also the kinship structure, or who stay, who join the group. These are the things that actually can help you identify.
Thank you. I entered a question mark, but before I do have lots of questions, but do we have anybody keeping an eye on our YouTube community? Are there any questions we have from the YouTube channel? Or do we have any questions from our students in the audience? I'll take those first. If I see questions.
There are no questions from Jordan Martin on YouTube. Just entered it now. Maybe I can bring this forward. Jordan Martin, he presented at the FINE last year. Some people might remember. He is a PhD student in Zurich. He worked on something like cooperative breeding in humans. And he writes, thanks for the fantastic talk. To what degree do you think our definition of environmental harshness needs to be clade or species specific? For example, cold climates have been considered harsh in some mammal research, while tropical climates are considered harsh in birds. Is there a common definition applicable across taxa, or should we focus more on the fitness effects per se of the environment rather than specific climate conditions? So the question is, how to define harshness, and can it differ between different taxa?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the reason I use birds is basically, I think you have more information about the environmental effect on their sociality. So that's why I can sort of use, for example, high rainfall as a benign and low rainfall as a harsh, or high temperature as harsh. These kind of definition, it's really, I think it's extremely important to have a clay label definition. For example, in my bird, the Taiwan yuhina, actually more rain in Taiwan, in a sense, is bad for them. I actually show that the reproductive success rate will be lower because heavy rain is just prevent them from foraging. Okay, so yes, I agree with you. It's best to have a clay label definition, but I think if you want to do, for example, a more large-scale comparative study, then the clay label information is important. But it's also, it would be better, in a way you can combine the definition to make it more general.
Thank you. I'm Eduardo Fernandez Duque at Yale University. So thank you for a fascinating talk. I'm still trying to wrap my head around the many levels at which you presented and you're working, going from just counting a few bearing beetles, doing their individual fitness-driven behavior to patterns of biogeographic variation. And what I wanted to, what you just said is really related to what I wanted to ask. You very humbly shared how when you submitted that first paper in 2012 to Science, one of the reviewers would say, well, but this is just correlational. Isn't it the case that all these analyses are still only correlational? So you do not we cannot really claim that there's an environmental effect on sociality with birds more than you were back then in 2012. If our only analysis about how environment shapes, of course, we're going to find answers. I mean, some of the associations are going to be stronger for some aspects of the environment, but that's leaving out a whole range of other possible explanations that are not being considered. Therefore, we're not moving away from, and that's what, again, I'm saying that because I don't work at this scale. I know that I'm probably missing something, but I cannot help it but be thinking back in the 70s, how is this different from the early stages of behavioral ecology, where we're just describing big patterns of variation, terrestrial, arboreal, nocturnal, diurnal. This is almost exclusively correlational, right?
Yeah, so to me, I actually think that these descriptive and correlational study are important, but to make it not, a just so story, I think it's important. First, I always like to have a formal theoretical model with multiple predictions. For example, in my 2012 paper, we have 4 predictions. So, if you have a formal model and have multiple predictions, you can test them. It's actually quite difficult for instance, that all the prediction fits. For example, here, what I try to do is, I would argue, the per capita productivity has certain relationship, and it has the relation, a prediction about their range size, abundance, and their genetic composition. But if you have more informations, I can tell you, you can first look at the group formation processes. Okay, so there are a more mechanistical understanding that why the pattern is the case it is. Because to me, I think it's almost unavoidable that for large scale study, it's going to be correlational. And I think it's just we need a better way to interpret these data. For example, the way we analyze is use the structural equation modeling. So it's easier to see if the concept, the logic link of your data fits what you think. So you can test it like more formally. So compare this to 30 years ago, I think there are huge differences. I think because of the data and also the way we analyze them.
Thank you. No, I totally agree. I truly believe in the power of all these studies. I mean, this impressive number of ideas that we can now go and explore the mechanisms. What I get a little bit confused when we start talking about the environment influencing, the effects of, and suddenly, and somebody in the audience may, well, it is an effect, it is an influence. We're not, but I agree with you. We need to go and explore the mechanisms. I mean, we still have that humongous black box of how these things are happening. But what you're doing is giving us a whole range of more specific ideas to be tested mechanistically. So I agree with you. Thanks.
Yeah, sorry, can I add one thing?
Yeah, of course.
Also, I think I like the barren beetle study because, for example, the temperature effect. Actually, what I didn't say is we can we actually heat the carcass, and we also cool the carcass,
right.
So we can directly see the manipulation and the response of their behavior. I like this type of study.
Yeah. I agree. Fantastic. Thank you. Our next question comes from Clara Jones. Clara? Clara, you're muted. There you go. On and off, try again. At least for me, you don't come.
Okay.
Now we can.
Okay, great. Clara Jones, I'm retired, behavioral ecology, mammals. Quickly, you've got a lot going on here. And so trying to unpack it a little bit. First of all, nice to see Steve Emlen highlighted. He was one of my professors in graduate school. Secondly, in 2014, I argued that where you get this relationship between and cooperation being induced in one species, you would expect, I think, that kin selection intensity more intense when cooperation is induced. And I think that that would be a fairly simple hypothesis to test. Finally,
No, we're not, Clara. Clara, you're not coming clear. Could you maybe type the question? Because you're getting all cut, and I couldn't understand unless it's only me, but I'm seeing some nodding that, yeah, the sound is not clean. Do you want to write the question?
can you hear me?
Now we can.
Okay, great. Sorry for the confusion. In 2014, I suggested that where you get this relationship between interspecific competition and cooperation being induced in one species, that you should find that kin selection is more intense in the species where cooperation is induced. I just want to throw that out because I think that would be a simple idea to test. But my specific question for you, you use the phrase total group productivity a lot, and I recognize that that phrase is used by Behrenkamp and quite a few others in the literature. I'm wondering, though, whether or not you're assuming that group selection operates as opposed to or in addition to individual level.
Yeah. So first is the way we derive the grouping benefit. Actually, it's totally used the inclusive fitness framework. So what we want to show is actually, if you consider individual interests from all the individuals, that would give you the condition that actually the total productivity needs to be greater than, you know, some of your solitary productivity. I think that's kind of sounds like group selection, but if it's derived from inclusive fitness theory. Okay, so I think it's sort of, I call it it's a necessary condition.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. The next question that I'll take, just to give everyone a chance, we'll go to Rag first, our speaker from last week.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you well.
Yeah. Well, I found this absolutely fascinating and very impressive because you talked about so many species. You know, I have spent all my life working on one species. So I really find this incredible that one can actually look at many, many species simultaneously. It seems to me that this is the first level of analysis where it doesn't matter what the species is. You are looking for general patterns that hold across species, which I think is a wonderful way to start. But I would imagine that the next step is to take your analysis to the level where it matters what species you're using. So general patterns break down if you include some species or if you exclude some species. And that might be a way to begin to understand the role of the taxon or the clade in generating these patterns. For example, just to take one example, I would imagine that some species are better at buffering themselves against a harsh environment. You know, in social insects build nests, for example. And there may be other species who are much more directly vulnerable to their environment. And these two kinds of species, for example, should behave very differently in that kind of an analysis. I don't know whether this makes any sense to you, but I would love to hear your comments.
Yeah, I think probably it's not clear in my talk. I believe that it's important to have a good information of one species and know the mechanism. For example, what I propose that the cooperation, collective action benefit can cope with harsh environment. So for example, in our barren beetle, actually we can see that they are more cooperative in the lower elevation when temperature is hot. Okay, so we know this is the mechanism that cooperation helps them to fight against the below flight competition in hot environment. That's why they can expand their distribution. So we can see sort of a similar pattern from one species to clay level, for example, our starling case, and to more generally, if you pull, combine different clades, we also see the same pattern. So yes, I think this hierarchical approach is really important, as you suggest.
Thank you. The next question is from Karsten.
Yes, thanks for the option to have a second question. You mentioned, which makes a lot of sense, that species in tropical environments where there's less fluctuation are maybe less flexible than in other environments. I was wondering, there has been some people argued, and I do not know if this is true, that also tropical rainforests differ in how old they are. Some people said that Borneo has the oldest rainforest and other rainforests are not that old. So that means there had been more variation before. Do you think it would ever make sense to put this comparison to tropical species and predicting that species from tropical rainforests that are supposedly much older would show less resilience than species from not so old rainforests?
Yeah, I mean, the sort of the traditional view, like Wallace proposed, is, or we call it favorability hypothesis in the macroecology, is in tropical region because it does not affect by the glacial period that much. Okay, so the clay there is generally older. Okay, but whether these older clays are more vulnerable or less vulnerable, I think people sort of don't take it from this part, but instead I think it's more like from the functional trait point of view. I think the most famous one is, as I mentioned, is Daniel Jason's argument about climatic variability hypothesis. Okay, and I think people start to look at the thermal tolerance. So, but it does not directly link with the history of the species. So I'm not aware that, people are arguing newer or younger clay are more vulnerable. But if you ask me, I would think that, older clay, because they probably experience longer and what's already selected. But it depends on the evolving stable or fluctuating environment. I think that's, yeah.
Thank you. And the next question is from somebody who knows also a little bit about burying beetles, Steve Trumbo.
Hi, Steve Trumbo from University of Connecticut. That was a great talk. So I had a question about this cooperation in harsh environments. I mean, and some might argue that in a harsh environment, individuals just might not value that reproductive opportunity that much. So they might be less conflict, and that might sort of look like cooperation. But I think you're saying more than that. So how would you differentiate cooperation in a harsh environment versus individuals just sort of not valuing that reproductive opportunity, or not just competing because there doesn't look like there's much chance that there's going to be reproductive success? So how do you, how can you make the case for cooperation that we can tell from that other possibility?
Yeah. So in our case of barren beetle, I think the most straightforward evidence is that they actually invest more time processes in the carcass when there are more below flight competition. So that, I think that against the argument that the carcass are less valuable. If it's less valuable, you won't invest so much time. Yeah, so I think you can, if we only quantify the degree of conflict, then yeah, I think that's not enough, as you suggest. Yes.
Yeah.
And also to add that is, I think, for example, in the more in hot environment, like lower elevation of Taiwan, it's like, if you don't take this chance, what else can you go? So in a way, it's always hot, right? So you need to take this opportunity. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The next question is from somebody who we'll hear from in a few weeks. Monique.
Hi, nice to be here. And thanks for, that was a very interesting talk.
If you can introduce,
you.
Monique, if you can introduce yourself.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
This is Monique Burgerhoff-Mulder. I'm from the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig. I'm an evolutionary anthropologist. Yeah, sorry about that. I like the way that you kind of predicate your talk and the whole sort of theory on the basis of the fitness benefits of cooperation, or the fitness benefits of different of living in different group sizes depends on the nature of the environment. But what I was confused by was you're differentiating two strategies, resource defense as opposed to collective action, because of course you can have collective action over resource defense. So I think I'm picking up on a point that other people have made before, but I'm not entirely, I don't quite understand how those two, why resource defense always has to entail relatively small groups because of the competition over resources. And alternatively, the idea of collective action is that it can produce a bigger and bigger group without conflict. I know this was asked before, but I wanted to really get you to pinpoint more, perhaps the behavioral differences, particularly when a species does both things, both resource defense and collective action.
Yeah, thank you for asking this question. I realized I didn't make this clear. And so I think the essential point here is the resource defense benefit. I think it applied to the species that has a sort of a relatively fixed amount of resource. I think that's the key. For example, in birds, it's a territory that is difficult through cooperation. In a way, you can defend bigger and bigger territory, but in a sense that it cannot be bigger, like twice bigger or 3 times bigger if you add more individuals. So I think that's the key of this type of benefit. It's defending a limited amount of resource. For example, barren beetles, if it's the case that it's just the carcass. And then things become more complicated is when you, for example, you have collective action behavior. So I know some people would think collective action collectively defends a territory. What would I call it? I think the key, as I said, I would consider, the resource is, in this case, cannot be increased through the cooperation. And I think that would be the key instead of, collective action. I cannot find a better term for that, but yeah, I know there are some confusions. So it's really how the behavior or cooperation influence the availability of the resources would make the distinction. And then you can generate the prediction about, the per capita versus group size relationship. So go back, now I realize that I didn't answer Carsten's question that if there are multiple benefit of cooperation occurring in one species. I think that's generally the case. For example, in the cooperative breeding birds, that's why people make the decision of why stay and why help. And people provide some way to test, the stay for the territory is the key, and helping it's just part of the reason. So to determine the relative importance, the best way would still be doing manipulation experiment to see what type of manipulation would resolve the group. then I think that's the best one. For example, the famous Seychelles warbler, if population become more dense and then offspring start to delay dispersal, I think that means it's a resource defense, because when the resource is no longer available, then you form a group. Okay, so that's sort of the basic idea.
I get it, but everything you've said talks about the nature of the environment. It does not talk about the behavior of the organisms. So I think your model will be more accurately stated in terms of, I mean, as you almost did with your figures, the models at the beginning, in terms of the returns to cooperation or the returns, the fitness returns to living in different group sizes. And that they just optimal with group size because of competition. And instead of division of labor or benefits of collective action, the benefits increase behavior. That's what I find confusing. I think the logic of what you're saying is absolutely right. But I think the way you're packaging it is a little bit confusing. I'll leave that.
Yeah, I agree. We actually struggle a lot on the terms and how to describe it. And yes.
I am listed next, but I'll take the opportunity to find out again if we have any questions from our YouTube community, or if we have anyone else who hasn't asked a question. This is a good chance.
There's nothing new on YouTube.
Okay, then I do have another. Jen, go ahead.
Hi, Jen Smith from Mills College, associate professor here in California. I just had a follow-up question from Monique, and I was curious about, there's collective action and there's resource defense, and often there are species that maybe engage in both of these behaviors together. So I'm curious, either in your field experiments, which are really amazing, by the way, or your modeling approaches, whether you actually can take those two scenarios and look at the interaction of them. So rather than have this dichotomous framework, could you actually have a third context where there's feedback loops between collective action, resource defense, and increasing the territories? Because of course we do see that in some of the species.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. I think it occurs a lot, and especially I think for the birds. So many cooperative breeder, people describe the processes that offspring stay. I think that's sort of the resource defense. But once offspring stay, instead of doing nothing, they can cooperate. Okay, so that's sort of a way to show that two things can occur. But I think what's your point that taking two together, I think that's also have an important implication of studying cooperative breeding birds. In that case, the two-stage, actually, it's just sort of heuristic understanding, because the reason you stay maybe is because the helping bring you some benefits. So maybe it's certain percentage is because of you stay, but certain percentage is because you help. So in that case, you need very high resolution experiments. So yeah, we try to do that in our barren beetle case. So we can exclude the blowfly, we can heat the carcass or cold carcass, and yeah, that needs this kind of very sort of detailed experiment. Then you can tease this apart. But what I try to argue is, if you want to know the general pattern, actually we provide some ways you can sort of know that which one is more important.
And then just as a follow-up to that, thank you for thinking about the experiments within your system, but have you also thought in a more comparative framework across different types of species, and to use that variation to start to think about the relative strength of the two models, or maybe their interaction between the two?
Yeah, that part, frankly speaking, we're still trying to figure that out because as I showed in our first comparative study, in a way, it's easy to show that, they cooperate in harsh or benign. But what if, two factors combined, they're not harsh or benign? And as I said, we have, more than 10 clay. That's the case. At this point, we don't know how to deal with it. And to be honest, I think the way to solve it is you need to look at each clay and see if there are good studies to show what are the mechanisms. So go back to the point that you need to look at more like individual species and these, so you can interpret the environmental effect and the interaction with the behavior better.
Do we have any questions from anybody who hasn't asked? If not, I'll take the chance to ask a second question, Sheng-Feng, and I'll just provide a little bit of context. It has to do with something you were discussing towards the end of your talk. So a long time ago, when I thought I was just getting started with a project focused on social behavior, I realized I was embarking on the study of the only primate genera in the whole of the Americas who has nocturnal habits. So there are 20, 25 genera of primates, and only one has developed any nocturnal habits. And what I'm going to get at is, I want you to comment some more on the diurnal temperature range, and I think the predictions you were making. What's happened with the system that we study, which ranges from Panama down to Argentina, and you have 10 or 11 species, all but one of those species is strictly nocturnal. The one that I study in Argentina, and this is what I want to get to, I think does something completely opposite to what you said, because if I understood you well, you said that the bigger the diurnal temperature range, we would expect to see animals become either nocturnal or diurnal. What we see with this system is that in an area of extreme diurnal temperature range, it's become cathemeral. It is both nocturnal and diurnal. It is only nocturnal in definitely in environments with smaller range of diurnal temperature variation. And now it's occupied both light environments in areas where the range is wider. Now, I didn't know what you mean by diurnal. Do you mean diurnal in the sense of the light period of a 24-hour cycle, or you meant a 24-hour cycle?
It's only the light period.
Huh.
So
what are the systems? I'm very interested in this. I mean, I suddenly found myself immersed in circadian biology. What are the systems and I'll show you some data. This is another fantastic thing we hear from colleagues through the FIND community. We have found ourselves collaborating with so many people we didn't know well enough. So what are the systems where you have seen this?
You mean the larger diurnal variation?
Yeah.
So the data we present it's using it's a comparative data set. So it basically uses all the vertebrate that available that with the elevational distribution. So lots of species, okay. But it's like a combined data. So it doesn't really have a particular species described in there. But I find the exception you mentioned, really blow my mind, because in a way, it's really hard for me to imagine that, if you have a large daily temperature, diurnal temperature range. Diurnal temperature range means the temperature in a 24 hours. Okay.
Oh, in 24 hours, not during the light phase of the 24-hour cycle. That's where definitions are important.
Diurnal means 24 hours.
Okay, that's because in circadian biology, that we would call DL, D-I-E-L. So that's different from diurnal. Okay, fine. That's why we need it. I'm glad I asked. So okay. But so we have a system here where the range is much larger in the subtropical area of Argentina than it is in the tropics, where you can really have a range of anywhere. You can have 20, 25 degrees Celsius of difference between your lowest and your highest in some 24-hour cycles. Mm-hmm. In that area, the animal doesn't commit to day or night because it is active when the environment is less harsh. So it's going to be active at night when it isn't very cold. It's going to be active during the day when it's very cold.
Yeah. So if that's the case, I think it makes more sense in a way, because if you have very large temperature variation just in the day, that means certain part of the day is going to be extremely hot. So I think that's sort of the limiting factor. So in this case, the least extreme I think it would constrain their activity time. I think that's why they need to use sort of the other times. Yeah.
I made a note. I'm going to follow up with you because I definitely want to know more about how you're thinking, and I'll be delighted. I mean, I'd love to share with you some of the data so that you can help me think about them.
Yeah, that would be great.
Anyone else? We have I cannot thank enough. It was Rag last week who joined us very late from India. We keep pushing our boundaries east. Today we have Sheng-Feng joining us from Taiwan. It is now 1:45 a.m. for him, and we cannot thank you guys enough. So we're looking for somebody from Australia or New Zealand to see how much further east we can go. But we have he's been great. Do we have any other more questions from anyone? Our students have been a little bit shy today, so we need to change. We want to hear from you guys. You bring freshness to the dialogue and the conversation. So please don't hesitate to jump in. If we don't have any more questions, I'm really owing it to the effort that Sheng-Feng has done, staying up all this late. We could call it a day or night, however we want to, whatever circadian term we want to use. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. At this point, we're going to finish our live streaming, and those of you for whom it is not 1 a.m, if you want to hang out a little bit more, we can do that. So I'll stop actually our live stream.